Good morning and a very warm welcome to our ThinkForest event today, where we'll be exploring the role of science in policymaking. I'm Rach Colling, Head of Communications at EFI, and before we begin our event, I'd just like to go through a few practicalities and some brief housekeeping with you. Firstly, if you're a participant, please make sure that your video is switched off for the duration of the event, as that means we can make the maximum use of the bandwidth. Secondly, please note that this event is being recorded and we'll make it available later on our YouTube channel, and we'll of course send a link to you all later on. Finally, thank you very much to those of you who submitted questions for this event. We'll be using some of these during the panel discussion later on. Please do join the conversation on Twitter also using the hashtag ThinkForest. Now, we have a fantastic programme for you today with 3 keynote speakers, followed by an interactive discussion. And today our speakers include Virginijus Sinkevičius, the European Commissioner for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries. We also have Pippa Hackett, the Irish Minister of State for Land Use and Biodiversity. And that'll be followed by Stephen Quest, the Director General of the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. Following on from that, we'll have our panel discussion. And on our panel today, we have Tuula, the Director General of the Natural Resources Department at the Finnish Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, Janez Potočnik, ThinkForest President and a former Minister and European Commissioner, Gillian Petrokofsky, a Research Fellow at the University of Oxford, and Jim Skea, Co-Chair of the IPCC Working Group 3. And then finally, we'll have some closing remarks from Lauri Hetemäki, EFI's Assistant Director. So I'll now hand you over to EFI's Director, Marc Palahí, who's going to set the scene for today's discussions and guide you through the rest of the event. Over to you, Marc.
Thank you, Rach. Dear ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to our ThinkForest event on the role of science in supporting policy making. This is a topic that is very much at the center of the European Forest Institute, because our mission is to connect knowledge to action, science to policy, in order to build a better understanding and support informed action on forest-related questions. Because at the European Forest Institute, we are not only conducting cross-disciplinary scientific research, we are also placing a lot of emphasis on synthesizing and contextualizing scientific knowledge so that it is easier for policymakers to use it. Our ThinkForest Forum, which is almost 10 years old, has become our main platform to discuss policy-relevant scientific findings and support an informed dialogue on European forests. We believe that this is very much needed nowadays because the polarization and complexity of forest-related questions and policies have increased dramatically during the last years. Simultaneously with the importance of our forests in addressing key societal challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and above all the need to create a new economy that prospers within our planetary boundaries. But today's ThinkForest event will not focus on a particular forest topic. We would like to zoom out to open up the discussion to reflect on how we can build together a most effective science policy interface in Europe, which indirectly, of course, is crucial also for the sustainability of our forests. I think that the current pandemic has provided additional arguments on the importance of science-informed policies and evidence-based policy making. And I think that this importance will only grow in the future because we are moving towards an increasingly complex, uncertain, and interconnected world in a time when we need to put forward probably the greatest economic transformation in human history due to the speed and scale of change that we need if we really want to move to a climate neutral and nature positive economy. Unfortunately, too many times scientists are only asked to provide the right answers when crises emerge. While I believe that one of the most important roles of science is to put the right questions to avoid unnecessary crises. But to do that, we need to see the science policy interface as a dynamic process where policymakers and scientists trust each other and work together to build a shared understanding of the world. I think all of us agree on the importance of doing that. The challenge, as with many things in life, is how to do that. And to discuss how to do that, you could see that we have an incredible group of speakers today. So I would like to start right away by listening to the Commissioner for Environment, Mr. Sinkevičius.
A very good morning to everybody. Thank you for this invitation to speak about the role of science in our forest strategy. Forests are very high on our agenda for many reasons. They are vital for the climate, for biodiversity, and of course they play an important role in the EU economy. The Commission wants to support all those roles and ensure their long-term sustainability. For all these reasons, forests play a major role in the European Green Deal, EU's effort to deliver a sustainable and climate-neutral economy by 2050, and for meeting the 2030 climate targets. An economy where biodiversity is protected and zero pollution and circular economy become the norm. Last year, under the Green Deal, we adopted an ambitious strategy for biodiversity, where we vowed to increase the quantity and quality of forests, as well as their health and resilience. This means more forest protection and more restoration, to preserve forest biodiversity and to increase EU carbon sinks represented by forests above and below ground. It also means a forest management that is more sustainable and an increased forest area and number of trees. We believe that at least 3 billion additional trees could be planted in EU by 2030. Very soon, we will publish a new EU forest strategy, which will take a systemic approach in the spirit of the Green Deal. It will present a vision for 2030 with concrete actions underpinned by scientific data to help us achieve these goals. I know you are particularly interested in how we engage with the scientific community in this area. To reassure you, of course, everything we do is grounded in science. The biodiversity strategy echoed the report of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. We are taking strong climate action in line with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. And we co-financed numerous research projects and actions through the LIFE program, which feed into our reflections. The Sincere project, coordinated by the European Forest Institute, is one of example, developing novel policies and new business models on forest ecosystem services. And we finance, coordinate, and support numerous science policy dialogues. The working group on mapping and assessing ecosystems and their services is one example. It brings together policymakers, stakeholders, and researchers, and we draw on their reports when we formulate policies like the coming forest strategy. With primary and old-growth forests, we are taking a similar approach. In the biodiversity strategy, we committed to defining, mapping, monitoring, and bringing the under strict protection. That work is being done in partnership with stakeholders and experts from the member states with support from the LIFE Prognosis Project. The Joint Research Center published in April a Science for Policy report on remaining primary and old-growth forests in Europe. So all this work is underpinned by robust science. We take a similar approach with the bioeconomy. The strategy here is to align the economy with the biosphere, to find new ways of producing and consuming bio-based resources in a resource-efficient circular economy, where sustainable biomass plays an important role. That requires better knowledge, because we need to know more about the impact on the ecological boundaries of our planet. That's why, under the Knowledge Center for Bioeconomy, the Commission created a network of experts to analyze scenarios for a sustainable bioeconomy. And we also benefit from strong support in-house from the European Environment Agency and the Joint Research Center. So the Commission is actively engaging with the scientific community. Changes are happening fast, and policy needs to follow together with our monitoring tools. The new challenges are reflected in our research priorities, and we are doing more to put this research into practice and to facilitate the uptake of scientific advice by foresters and land managers. Our forest strategy is still maturing, and we are still collecting inputs to deliver a strategy that meets the needs of all. But it's nearing completion, and it will be backed, of course, by rigorous science. And we are counting on your full support to roll out this agenda across the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your reflections on how science is being used by the European Commission, especially in view of developing the new EU forest strategy. But now we are moving live to Ireland, because we are very lucky to have with us the State Minister for Land Use and Biodiversity, Mrs. Pippa Hackett. It is a pleasure to have you with us, and especially being so early in Ireland. So thank you very much, Minister. And so, Minister, I would like to ask, what are your views on the need and the importance of building an effective science policy interface?
Good morning, greetings from Dublin and our temporary Parliament home at the Convention Centre in Dublin due to COVID. They had to give us more space. So yeah, look, thank you very much. Look, it's great to be here, and I think your question is very very apt, and I think the discussions that will take place today will really be informing what we do. I have a presentation or a speech to give. Will I give that first, or will I answer your question first? Yeah, okay, that's fine. I'll start with that then. But really, just to thank the European Forest Institute for inviting me here. And I think the words of the Commissioner before I spoke, I think really highlight the importance of forestry and how it can serve us, societal and economic and obviously environmental. So I think that's really important. I think the lineup of the speakers, as you say, will be really interesting ahead, and the panel discussion will be great. But as you say, yeah, I'm the Minister with responsibility for land use and biodiversity in the Department of Agriculture here in Ireland. I'm also a woodland owner myself, so I'm, I suppose, very much aware of the need for evidence-based information to inform decision making in relation to forestry. Really, it is only through science that we understand the role that forests play, not only in regulating our climate and in understanding indeed the vulnerability of our climate, but also in terms of protecting habitats and protecting biodiversity. And we hear an awful lot of this, and rightly so. In Ireland, climate change is having some, quite specific effects, indeed, on forestry. For example, our frosts are occurring earlier. The spring is occurring earlier than it used to do in the 1970s, and we have less incidents of frosts. So we have that milder, wetter winters, and everyone knows a good spell of cold, icy conditions, certainly does a lot to kill many pests and so forth. So, we find that is impacting our forestry species, and it certainly raises questions over how adaptable our forests will be in the future to adapt to those. We've also increased incidence of some tree diseases here, and I suppose most striking for us has been the ash dieback disease. Ash as a tree has a very special role in Irish culture and in sporting significance. Anyone who might be aware of the game of hurling, where players have a hurl, as it's called, it's made from ash. So it's very important for us, really. So it has been devastating for our trees, and indeed the future of the sport potentially, but they're working on it. I think the academic research is really important, and I think the Commissioner alluded to the importance of this and how the Commission are supporting research in this area. And I think that highlights for us we need to be aware in Ireland of the wealth of academic research out there, and I think sharing the resources will help everyone. I think what is of key importance also is to enable the public and wider stakeholders to input into the policy-making process. Across Europe and indeed in Ireland, forests are a very viable and key part of the landscape. We have quite a low level of afforestation in Ireland, and we are working hard to increase that level. But we have to do that in a sympathetic manner to the environment. And if you speak to many people here, you could speak to 10 different people and they will have a different view about what forests mean, from one extreme of not liking any forests to a complete extreme of really, just seeing them as an economic, something to gain economically from, and little else. So I think it's very, we specifically find that in Ireland, to bring everyone on board to try and, chart out a really sustainable future for forestry. So I think, that whole piece of all of society and all stakeholders need to be factored into the policy-making process. So at the moment in Ireland, we are currently embarking on the development also of a new forestry strategy to guide forestry and the forestry sector into the future. And as Minister with the responsibility for forestry, I have established a national forestry policy group made up of all those broad range of stakeholders. So we will have industry representatives, we'll have environmental NGO representatives, and also the state agencies, which are crucially involved in the forestry sector. So we will have like our Environmental Protection Agency, we'll have our state-owned Cuilcha, our state-owned forestry body, as well as our agricultural advisory services involved. So it's not an easy undertaking to keep everyone on board, but we're working hard, and everyone really wants to do the best for forestry. So under an initiative I called Project Woodland, this particular group will oversee the development of this new strategy, and its goal really is to maintain and strengthen the vision for forestry in Ireland, so that it fits with everyone, because we do have situations again in Ireland where some communities have been overwhelmed with forestry from a commercial perspective, and that resonates around the country. We are a small country, so what happens in one region soon gets around the rest. So I see it as my role to try and turn that view around, turn the argument around, and for everyone to really embrace what forestry means. And that's where we do rely a lot on the science and what the information we determine as policymakers to design a new strategy. So I think we do recognise that this shared vision is very important. We must build obviously on the successes of the past, but learn from the lessons from some of the failures too. And again, all the information we can garner to do that from science in particular is very important. And probably for us, the environmental science aspect of it is very important also, and how we adapt to climate change and so forth. So I think that we are really, we're looking at using national institutes, national forums to enable that discussion and to give people the opportunity and give the scientific community the opportunity to feed into the policies. And it's reasons really, I suppose, such as this, that Ireland has had a long association with the EFI, and we're very supportive of the work that is carried out in promoting excellence in forestry, and indeed helping to inform the forestry policy internationally and as well as throughout Europe. So the ThinkForest events, and I think are facilitated and they're funded through the EFI's multi-donor trust fund, and I think they've been a very important platform in disseminating this information. We've been glad as a country to support work through our participation as a donor member, and we do acknowledge the excellent work that has been achieved. So too do we acknowledge the work that the programmes hosted by the EFI and the ongoing work, particularly in terms of European forest genetic resources, because I think that's going to be really important moving forward, the type of species we choose to plant. And we hear a lot about the diversity of our forests, I think, are going to become more and more important. And then how do we fit a very diverse forestry model with a sector that demands really uniformity in a sense of wood and supply. So there are very difficult questions to ask. I mean, the science is there, but it's fitting the science with the people on the ground and with the sector itself. Obviously within the confines of all the environmental regulations and legislations that exist. So to sum up, I think it's a really important time for European forestry. The European Green Deal, as the Commissioner highlighted, and the EU biodiversity strategies, and indeed the upcoming EU forest strategy will all shape the future of forestry. And I think it's incumbent on us as decision makers to really think about the challenges and opportunities facing us. Science has given us many tools and some answers to address these challenges and opportunities, but there's always more to learn. And I think forests are such an intrinsic part of our landscape. I hope we have many more forests over the next decades in Ireland that people are comfortable with and see as a really strong natural resource and something that they cherish. And I suppose that's what I have set myself the target as trying to achieve that, or at least achieve a strategy that will deliver on that. So in our capacity as leaders and policymakers, we have to provide the right conditions. We have to be visionary in our approach and encourage collaboration across society. We know that our forests are vulnerable to climate change. We know that some forests challenge biodiversity, whereas other ones support it. And look, I suppose individually we don't have all the answers, but again, that collective approach that we need to take, not only within my own country of Ireland, but across Europe and internationally is so important. So I think a brighter, greener future certainly will lie ahead. And, thanks indeed to events like this and organisations like yourself to deliver on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you very much for the support from Ireland, and especially that Ireland was one of the founding members of our multi-donor trust fund for policy support. So you have been really pioneering country in supporting us. I have just a concrete follow-up question, if I may.
Yeah.
Do you interact directly with science? And how do you get your scientific based information when you need to do policy making?
I suppose, look, in Ireland, we have a number of expert-led forums that work across many different disciplines. So we have a particular department-supported group called COFERD, and they really specialise in specific subject areas. So perhaps genetic resources might be one, and they will interact with the scientific knowledge that's there and almost formulate it in a act as an intermediary, I understand, to formulate it in a more of a policymaker-friendly way, because at the end of the day, the policymakers are politicians. They aren't experts in the science, or they aren't experts in the forestry, but we need that intermediary approach to digest it and tell us what to do with it. So I think that's been very useful and worked really well for us here in Ireland. And I think the recommendations that come out of these forums and gatherings, they will certainly shape the future direction of what we do. And I think the science is changing all of the time, and also what type of science we need. I mean, I suppose 30 years ago, we might have thought we needed so much ecological science or hydrological science. So I think the broadening of the base of the scientific knowledge we need is increasing. Environmental science is really going to be, I think, very much key moving forward. So I just look forward to seeing how it progresses and where the science come from, and how we target those areas of science in the future with our young people today. How do we guide them into those areas, because that's what we will need in the decades and generations ahead.
Thank you, Minister, and I hope we can meet soon in your beautiful and welcoming country.
Absolutely, I look forward to that. That would be great.
We will, and please enjoy the rest of the event if you have some time, and otherwise have a very nice day.
Thank you very much. I have to pop out. I have some parliamentary questions to take in my chamber, so I'll try and come back after those. But listen, thank you very much, and have a wonderful event.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Okay, now we move to the next speaker of today, who will be setting the scene for the discussion in the panel. And I have the pleasure now to welcome the Director General of the European Commission's Joint Research Centre, Mr. Stephen Quest. Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Marc. How are you?
Very well. Nice to have you here. So thank you for coming. And Stephen, I would like to ask you how we can translate the best science in Europe into sound EU policies, and what is the role of the Joint Research Centre in doing that?
Okay, well, that's
it's a big question.
It's a big question, yeah. Well, look, maybe I'll just try and answer that with some opening remarks, and if I don't do it properly, you can pick up on me at the end. I mean, first of all, a big thanks to you for having me on this event. And I mean, the Joint Research Centre is the European Commission's in-house science service. We've been around a long time. We were created way back at the beginning of the European communities under the Euratom Treaty, so we got 60 years of experience under our belt. And we're the in-house science service of the European Commission, 2,000 scientists situated in 5 of our different member states, working on all different aspects now of European policy, going well beyond nuclear. Obviously, things have evolved a lot since the 1950s. And as you heard there from the Commissioner in his video message, the work that we do in the Joint Research Centre is really essential for underpinning different policy initiatives that the Commission is preparing. I mean, he talked in particular about the Green Deal, about the upcoming forestry strategy, bioeconomy strategy, and generally speaking, in the Joint Research Centre, we'll be doing work scientific work, analysis reports, and also foresight work to prepare these different policy initiatives and to help ensure that the policymakers and the politicians, when they come to take their decisions, are doing this on the basis of the best possible science that we can muster and that we can present to them. And I think that, I mean, the topic of this conference itself is extremely topical because, you know, what we've seen in the last year and a bit more now is with the pandemic is that science is really at the very heart of the public debate. And to an extent, perhaps that is, I mean, I'd say fairly unprecedented. You know, I don't think we've ever seen quite so many epidemiologists and virologists and other experts appearing on daily media shows alongside policymakers, trying to make sense of what's going on and trying to help navigate the sort of the political challenges that we're facing with this pandemic. And this really, I think, has brought to the fore the importance and the relevance that science has in supporting policy. I mean, it's always been the case, but it's perhaps not been quite so visible in the past, I would suspect, to the general public. And it also, I think, underlines the complexity of the issues that we're having to deal with, and that, you know, the science policy debate is also, you know, caught up in that complexity, and we in the Joint Research Centre, like other scientific organisations, have to try to navigate that complexity. Now, just to give you a word of the broader setting, the European Commission just a couple of weeks ago published a communication on better regulation, which is all about how we can ensure that the regulation that we do is really top-notch and relevant for the policy agenda. And in this new communication, and this is I think a very positive development, we recognise explicitly that scientific evidence is also a cornerstone of better regulation, and that we will seek to mobilise this through engaging with the research community in the regulatory process from the start. Now, that may have happened in the past, but it's the first time I think the Commission has been so explicit in putting scientific evidence and the research community in the forefront of the regulatory process. So I think that's one positive side effect of perhaps the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic has revealed, I think in a very stark way, how difficult it is to organize the science for policy process, because we have to navigate who are the right experts to consult. I mean, especially when we're dealing with these multidimensional areas where, you know, science is very abundant, but we need to try and find a way of condensing it and presenting it in an understandable way. We've got to find ways of integrating science from different disciplines and bringing together different aspects of the same problem in a comprehensible way. And we need to ensure that the experts are acting as honest brokers and not falling into the trap of being sort of advocates for particular issues. So there's some big questions, I would say, on the side of the science supply side, if I can put it that way. But there are also issues and complications on the policy side itself, because you know, it's important that policymakers are able to understand the science, which is not always easy, and that they're able to distinguish between evidence which may necessarily be of varying quality. We need to help manage, I think this is a real challenge, the expectations of policymakers as regards science and the ability of science or not to provide definitive answers. And I can tell you from personal experience, managing that is often quite challenging. And how can we make sure that policymakers don't fall into the temptation of cherry picking evidence to support a particular point of view with obvious negative consequences? And how do we ensure that policymakers are transparent about the way that they're using evidence and about, in particular, the trade-offs that necessarily inform their choices? Nothing wrong with trade-offs, but we have to think to be clear that they need to be transparent if we're going to gain public trust. So there's a whole bundle for me of very important questions there in the discussion about how science can support policy, and I think that this event is a great opportunity to start to unpack some of those. In the Joint Research Centre, we consider it a little bit our bread and butter. To be doing this, and we've been trying to continue to adapt our practices to take account of these challenges. I'll give you one example of what we've been doing to try to stay ahead of the curve. And this is the development of what we call knowledge centers, which are commission-wide bodies. We have one, for example, a knowledge center on the bioeconomy. And in these knowledge centers, we bring together the science and the policy. So we co-chair them with the relevant policy directorate generals of the Commission. And we bring together all of the relevant directorate generals of the Commission to discuss and to prioritize what knowledge is needed to support achieving the different policy objectives. So if you take the bioeconomy, we're bringing together maybe 10 different services of the Commission who have an interest in the bioeconomy, and using this as a space and a moment to bring together the policy and the knowledge. And we work on the one hand as a knowledge producer, because we do our own research in-house, and obviously we can share that through the center, but also as a knowledge manager, because there's a lot of knowledge that comes from outside the Joint Research Center, and we organize in that sense a community of practice with good tools to effectively share knowledge, mobilization of networks, and drawing in content from external organizations and stakeholders as well, to really provide a sort of one-stop shop for all of the knowledge that you would need to do to manage an effective policy in this area. And the thought process underpinning the Knowledge Center is that no single profession and no single discipline can address all of these complex challenges on their own. So it's really a structure to try to mobilize, structure, and organize collective intelligence at the interface between science and policy, and to allow direct interactions with policymakers. So that for our side, on the scientists, we can clarify what the policymakers need. We can help to manage their expectations about the answers that science can provide, and they can also help to join up the policymakers' questions as well, which is very important for us from this better regulation point of view, the coherence of policy, and helping to manage the trade-offs in the political sphere. So these knowledge centers is one side of the coin about how we can deal with these science policy interfaces. I mean, other innovations would include things like getting colleagues to work to inform policies themselves, because not every scientist has the right set of skills to engage with policymakers. So we also do work in-house to train our own scientists in the skills and the competencies that they would need to be able to more effectively engage with policymakers, and indeed to communicate on the science, which is another important skill set, because this is also very important. So, I mean, in a nutshell, I'd say there's no easy one-size-fits-all solution to all of this. But we've got a variety of tools that we use, and I think the key underlying message is that we need to have a strong value base on which the interactions between science and policy rest. And this takes us to respect for the independence and the integrity of science and the scientific process, paired with honesty on the side of the scientists in terms of the limitations of their findings, and paired with a transparency in the use of science in policy making. And I think if we can get those aspects right, then we will be on a firm footing. And I think that this event and the discussion that we're about to have is going to be a very valuable contribution to helping us to do this even better in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. This was really a perfect introduction to set the scene for the panel discussion. And I just wrote down some keywords that I think are very relevant. You mentioned the complexity, the challenge of abundant information, so rather the fragmentation of knowledge, which is a main challenge, the need for honest brokers, manage well expectations, transparent process, and put on the table the potential trade-offs in the science policy interface. And also, I very much like what you mentioned, that we need also specialized tools. You mentioned the knowledge centers, and also to train our scientists to be able to convey better the messages to policymakers, understand the context, the scale, the format that policymakers need. So thank you very much, Stefan. And I invite you to stay with us in the panel because you might be willing to reflect on some of the interventions by the panelists. But let's move now to the panel discussion. And I would like to start with you, Janez, for very obvious reasons. You have been Commissioner for Science. You have been Commissioner for Environment. You are the co-chair of the International Resource Panel, President of ThinkForest. So you're the perfect person for this debate because you have been responsible at the highest level to develop the strategy for European science. You have been dealing with the environment, which is a very complex issue where you were in need of scientific information. And now you are really facilitating and working at the science policy interface. So Janez, I would like to start with a very general question. How do you see the role of science evolving during the last years, during all this time that you have been there, in between the science and the policy?
Yeah, actually, I'm really quite well positioned, as you said, Marc, and the real question would be only how much time you have. So I think, so I was seeing, of course, the whole development from, as you rightly mentioned, from all the sides. And I think, as you know, as Commissioner for Science and Research, my primarily responsibility was actually providing science, creating best conditions for science, that it would thrive, that creating best financial governance conditions. On one hand, supporting the basic research, which is of course important, but on the other hand, also applied research, which is the most important part for immediate needs, which are connected to policy making. Designing impactful programs. So that was the time of Framework Program 7 ERC. At that time, we have actually built it, private-public partnerships, externalization, all that which is today very much the essence of the scientific field around European Commission and European Union was actually built during that mandate. So work with scientists, to be entirely frank, it's very rewarding, but it's not always the easiest. Practically, you are working only with people who are all holding at minimum one PhD, and they do not accept you easily as somebody who is their peer, and it needs some time and trust building. And I think that was quite a nice experience also, which I have had. Part of that efforts was exactly making the science better understandable, accessible, user-friendly, useful. Of course, JRC was also at that time under my responsibility, and I have always considered it as extremely valuable scientific support to in-house policy needs. And my major role at that time was actually persuading colleagues in the Commission that they would understand that, because they have never seen it really as their own. And EA was also important, but they've had different status, but they have provided quite serious knowledge and analysis. But as already mentioned by Stephen, integrity, independency of science for me was critical, and this was the thing which you need to defend and create the things at that very moment. So it's always time needed for judgment. So I think any of those evaluations, which we sometimes hear very well from the people when they evaluate their own period of time, I found that pretty funny, to be honest, because I think it's not on you to judge what you have done during your period. As Commissioner for Environment, which was, it was a bit different because I was on the other side. Of course, it helps a lot that I've been before connected to R&D. Why? Because I have acquired important knowledge which was connected to environment, but also I understood well how the instruments which we have had could be used, and including the JRC. So maybe the best example was of the use of scientific work. I'm pretty sure that Stephen also recalls it, was this diesel exhaust case. addressing the NOx problems, gaps between the laboratory tests and the actual driving pollution results. It was called at that time Dieselgate, and it was quite an affair targeting many diesel car producers, in particular, if you remember, Volkswagen, who after that switched their policy entirely. And JRC was instrumental for providing me facts and figures, which led me to exposing those things publicly enough, and also through some of the things which came from the civil society in United States. We just started to push the case. So I think I have always tried to build this scientific support around me, so strong scientific advice. But the fact is that I was environment commissioner still in times when economic and environmental developments were seen as being in contradiction. That's the fact. I have always based my proposal in scientific evidence, but unfortunately, sometimes it was simply not enough. Convincing colleagues, having, for example, all scientific data, how damaging the air pollution for health is, what damaging the health implications are. And what really helped was convincing economic figures, which was sometimes really unpleasant, but it helped a lot that I was educated in economics, and I tried actually to win quite a lot of arguments by using the colleagues' language. European Green Deal, I think it's a big step forward. So at least when it comes to vision targets, what I consider there is still that implementation is relatively uncertain. I see 3 reasons. It does not sufficiently address drivers and pressures that cause environmental damage. It does not offer a systemic perspective to guide decision making. And of course, implementation is put at extra risk due to the COVID-19 recovery. The thing which I'm currently focusing on, it's being co-chair of United Nations IRP, is this science policy interface. So major challenge there is how to present scientific results in a way that they are understood and useful. And I think this is many times not really the major virtue of scientists. They tend to be quite perfectionists, and the way they are judged through publications and peer-reviewed journals sometimes does not help either. So having a good mixture of excellent scientists and experienced policymakers is quite a big guarantee for success. To conclude, some general conclusions which I would have from this period are importance of knowledge. Science for policymaking is simply no-brainer. So hardly you would find anybody who would disagree with that. It's more about how seriously and sincere we are in doing that. Of course, science should evolve, but we have to support it. But in many cases, there is not the shortage of scientific evidence that it's lacking, but rather the knowledge among policymakers and political will. So science was and still is important in policymaking, as we have heard from Commissioner Sinkevičius, but too many times, as we have also heard by Stephen, it's used in the cherry-picking way. So it's used to support a chosen policy rather than to help designing the right choice. And there it's about fundamental sincerity. And I think what is always needed is at the end, it's democratic, transparent, critical monitoring and assessment of how policymakers are actually using the science. And impact assessments are definitely important tool and help, but again, too many times I have found that economic implications were prevailing in policy formulation judgments, which it's now changing, but it is an important fact. And finally, many times, unfortunately, it takes time that some scientific facts prevail. In particular, if they are uncomfortable, linked to uncomfortable changes. The recipe for success is repetition, 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 creating critical mass, trust, creating ownership, and suddenly you actually don't know why the window of change appears, and some changes which were not possible sometime before are now possible. So, in short, we should not forget the wisdom of the doors. People are strange. We want and support changes, but we don't want actually to change.
Thank you, Janez, for these very good insights. And we are going to come back to many of the issues that you mentioned, like cherry picking, that the challenge is not the shortage of scientific information, but probably the abundance and the lack of structuring around in a policy, palatable format. But now I would like to move to the next panelist, Tuula Packalen, who is the Director General for Natural Resources at the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in Finland. Huomenta, Tuula.
Hyvää huomenta.
Yes. By the way, you have the perfect profile also for this event because you have been a top scientist and now you are in a very high decision-making position in the ministry. So thank you for being with us today. And I would like to start with a question regarding your two different lives. What is more challenging? To be a scientist willing to support policy making by passing scientific information, or being a policymaker looking for science-based information in the right format, scale, and context?
It is definitely more challenging to get the right information for supporting policy making. Scientists define the borderlines of their study and consequently make conclusions considering how and where the results can be generalized. But when providing policy support, we need to understand the related phenomena and impacts of policies comprehensively. For example, ecological and socio-economic conditions and value chains differ between countries and sub-regions. And in EU policy processes and national policy processes, we need to cover the whole picture. And if researchers provide new knowledge that cannot be generalized over the policy problem as a whole, it may be difficult for policymakers to utilize their contribution. For scientists, it may look like their message was not received, but this is how we could find something to improve the situation. And I think that the science policy interface would benefit from multidisciplinary collaboration and a joint framework, which would help to set these context-sensitive and generalizable national inventories and statistics with scientific results presented by researchers in journals and set that into the big picture at sub-regional, national and EU level. And I think in these organizations such as EFI could have a significant role in facilitating this kind of information exchange between scientists and policy organizations.
Thank you, Tuula. And one question, do you think being a scientist makes your work now easier in the ministry? I mean, do you have let's say, a comparative advantage to other colleagues that have not had a scientific career, or it makes your job more challenging?
Having a long scientific and science networking experience helps, of course, in finding information from the relevant top quality journals and experts, and also in checking how generalizable the results in papers are. But I think that my colleagues with a long career in policy making or policy support, they have other strengths. They know the organizations, processes and stages that are involved in the policy preparation and what are the typical questions presented by different participants in those processes, and also how to prepare beforehand for those questions. And of course, they are also much better in diplomacy and finding the right words.
So at the end of the day, I think it's about diversity, no? Having complementary team members so that you can support each other. Thank you, Tuula. We will come back to you now. I would like to move to the next panelist, Professor Jim Skea from the Imperial College London, and also the co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 3 on mitigating climate change. Good morning, Jim. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm very well, thanks.
Thank you. Well, I think most people agree that the IPCC is probably the most well-known science policy boundary organization in the world, and most people also would agree that its work is considered to be credible, relevant, and legitimate. But can you share your experience during all these years? What do you see as the main barriers for translating science into policy action? And if you can, of course, explain some anecdotes, I think you might have many.
I'm sure I do. And just to say that just because IPCC has been around for 30 years, please don't think we've got it all right. New problems throw themselves up all the time. But for me, you know, part of the strength of the process is we actually have a well-structured process for engagement between scientists and policymakers. And you know, that process of agreeing summary for policymakers line by line is helpful. And we also have a fairly well-defined mandate to work to, which was set up right at the start as assessing the science of climate change, environmental and socioeconomic impacts, and slightly more controversially, formulating response strategies to meet the challenge. And that is the one part of the mandate that's always proved tricky, because that has been refined where we have this sort of mantra that's engraved in the heart of every IPCC scientist to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And that kind of boundary is an enormously difficult one to do. And very often you can address it simply by turning a sentence around and expressing it a different way. But that's something that scientists are not always sensitive to. I also think our challenge is that we're increasingly not just having the hard natural sciences, but economics, social sciences, international relations. When you start to bring this into the science policy interface space, this is really quite difficult. I guess you know, one lesson that I've learned, and it's sort of burning at the moment, is the question that scientists don't often realize that they're making assumptions that they think are completely natural, and so they never mention them, but they have enormous implications when you play them into the policy space. And I'll give an instance that's directly relevant to forests, which is the question of the partitioning of sinks and sources between anthropogenic and natural. And it's done differently in the emission inventories than it is from modelling. And we are just starting to realise the kind of implications of that in the policy sphere for net zero. So thanks to Stephen for Giacomo Grassi at ISPRA, who has the whole issue is named after him, the Grassi issue. It has become so critical, but it's the kind of thing, you know, that's going to be important. And just to say one thing that we have done in the recent cycle, and it's been driven by COVID actually, is that as well as the formal review processes in IPCC, we've supplemented them with informal webinars between scientists and government delegates, where we have deliberately taken what we think will be the most controversial issues in the summary for policymakers, get the scientists to present them to the governments, and then have an exchange about these difficult issues, which we hope will lubricate the subsequent more formal processes that we have to go through. I could, like others, I could go on for a long time, but let me stop there.
Thank you, Jim. No, very, very interesting. And one curiosity, Jim, what is more challenging, to bring consensus among scientists on a particular topic or document, or to bring consensus between scientists and policymakers, for example, when you are developing the summary reports for policymakers?
You missed out one category, which was getting consensus among different sets of policymakers. And just to say, this consensus issue is a challenging one, because IPCC, you know, I feel jealous of IPBES colleagues, for example, and I see the delegates from Wildlife Trust, Ministry of Environment, and I look at our delegates from the Ministry of Petroleum or the Ministry of Planning and Infrastructure in a small island developing state, and the challenge of pulling that is together. So, but we do have processes within IPCC for doing that. I mean, the scientists are required to describe different views on controversial topics in their reports. And I may say this cycle, because we've had these special reports that are collaborations between the working groups, the amount of interaction between scientific communities has accelerated. And of course, that's caused difficulties, but I think it will be ultimately beneficial that that's taken place. And just to say on the interactions, you know, between policymakers, again, IPCC has formal processes for looking at differences between, you know, what different different policymakers will say. When you're chairing a meeting, you will constantly turn to the scientists and say, is this statement compatible with the underlying scientist? And sometimes 3 competing statements are all compatible with the underlying scientists, but the policymakers won't agree which one they want to put. So that's the kind of challenge we face in the real world. And every time you think you've got it fixed, a new challenge comes up that's specific to the issue that you're looking at.
Thank you very much, Jim. Let's continue with the last panelist of today, Gillian Petrokofsky, Associate at Oxford University. Good morning, Gillian. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Mark. Great to be here, sitting here fascinated by everything that's been said so far.
Thank you, but let's continue being fascinating. And you have been doing for many years, Gillian, research on the importance of quality evidence in the science policy. And I think Janez mentioned, well, several of you mentioned the issue of cherry picking honesty, because one of the most challenging situations that we are facing is when scientists basically disagree on a concrete topic, question, or disagree on the policy implications or policy recommendations. What can you say about that? Which processes can we put forward? Which tools could we use to address this challenge and try to get a broad information base, consistent one, that which is, you know, easily uptaken by policymakers?
Well, I think this issue of cherry picking is a really interesting one. And in fact, it was precisely the problem of cherry picking medical evidence that stimulated the setting up of systematic reviews and the codifying of systematic reviews way back in 1993 with the Cochrane collaboration, which most people have heard of. And the systematic review was codified, and its processes were determined really as a review of a clearly formulated question that uses systematic and reproducible methods to identify, select, and then critically appraise all relevant research and collect and analyze data from the studies that are involved in that review. And these methods have developed over time. They've been used in social sciences, they've been used in education, they've been used in conservation and management, and we set up an initiative in 2013 to bring it to forestry. So it's not specific to the medics, this concept of systematic review. And one of the fathers of systematic review really says that the evidence process of a systematic review must be designed to minimize the likelihood of confusing the effects of interventions or management decisions with the effects of biases and chances. And that's really precisely what we're trying to do in the systematic review process. It's to sort out where biases are high or likely to be high, and ultimately by undertaking a review which has a very structured methodology, very similar to primary science methodology, where everything is clear, everything is transparent and repeatable, then policymakers have a better chance of looking at where the balance of probability lies on the effectiveness or the what has gone before, the effectiveness of a certain intervention and so on. And one of the biggest problems, I think, in some of the reviews that one reads, particularly from very powerful NGO organizations at times, is that you can't tell how did they find the citations that they're going to talk about? How did they select them? And how did they synthesize them? If we answer those questions honestly and openly, then we've got a better chance of saying this is a robust evidence base from which to take decisions. And that's then over to the policymakers in the context of what society wants to make a decision. But at least we've got our science in order, and we haven't cherry-picked that which we want to highlight at the expense of other research or that we want to hide. So it's a fairly simple concept, really. Search, select, and synthesize transparently and in a repeatable way, and do this in collaboration with stakeholders, which include other academics, it includes policy and decision makers, and includes wider society.
Gillian, you mentioned NGOs now. what do you think which role NGOs are playing nowadays in this science policy interface? Also other interest groups, but NGOs are using more and more, of course, scientific information as arguments for their putting forward their agendas. What do you think about the role NGOs are playing nowadays?
Well, that's a tough question, and
you're a tough woman, so.
I'm a tough woman, right? At the risk of having a great pile on from my very few numbers of Twitter followers, I think not all NGOs are the same.
Yeah.
But can I highlight this with an example that I think we came across recently when I was, right. So we undertook a systematic review of the potential harmful effects on biodiversity in forests of the Southeast USA of producing wood pellets from woody biomass.
Yeah.
So the stimulation for this really interesting, and we're facing this problem in Europe as well, to find, is there really a biodiversity impact? And the stimulus for this was a report that came out of the NRDC, and their report in 2017 said, and I quote, "There's a growing body of peer-reviewed science and ground-level evidence showing that the pellet industry threatens natural ecosystems." Well, I looked through that report. I followed every reference that they cited. And in fact, to cut the story rather short, the two main studies that they used in support of some claims about soil quality in particular, of the 74 studies that were in the review that they cited, only one related to the USA forests. And in the other very important study, that was a study on European forests and had nothing to do with the forests of the Southeast USA. And they claimed that studies showed that conversion of natural forests to plantations can reduce soil carbon up to 15% compared to traditional harvests. But the author themselves had said there was a negligible oxidative loss of carbon from soils. In fact, there might even be a slow but long-term increase in detrital carbon as charcoal. So it was exactly the opposite of what the scientists have found. But the report looked good. It's a very credible organization, and I'm not implying that they can never do good work. I'm simply drawing an example of one that we did look at it in quite some detail. And in fact, the results of our review showed that there was no overall harm to biodiversity. There were some studies that you could have found that showed a short-term disruption, of course, but on the whole and in the longer term, you can't make a case for this growing body of peer-reviewed science showing great harm. And I think it's this, not only cherry-picking the science, but cherry-picking bits of what the sciences say, so that there's some truth in it, but it's not generalizable. And that's the whole point about systematic reviews, to try and present evidence that's generalizable. So I'm not saying all NGOs do bad work by any means, Marc, but I think that they're not necessarily accountable in the same way that publishing in a journal, Annals of Forest Science, Forest Policy and Economics, International Forest Review. Here, the editors take great pains to get good peer review, and this helps enormously with some of the problems that you find in these rather attractive looking, easily available, free NGO reports. So we have a problem in a way. They compete against rather expensive information, which is something we haven't discussed today. And that might be something we would want to explore. So
Thank you, Gillian.
Okay, I could go on.
Thank you, because this is really a very important topic that I am sure that the colleagues in the panel would like to reflect, because this is crucial and we see it more and more often happening. And so I believe that scientists need to be more proactive also in the science policy interface, because if scientists are not active, other actors which are not scientists will be the ones active in the science policy interface. And then things like the one you mentioned are happening, and we create even more confusion. We start throwing it to each other, scientific papers, and everything becomes rather difficult. So I think this is crucial, and we really need the science policy boundary organizations playing an important role. Otherwise, all others that are not prepared to do that will do it, and we will not advance. I am sure many of you want to comment on the comments by your colleagues, but before giving you the floor, and by the way, wave to me if you want to speak. I would like to give the floor again to Stephen if you want to, because I saw that you were writing a lot of things, and probably you have some comments, or unless you were writing poetry.
No, poetry is not my strong suit. So no, I mean, it's been really fascinating discussion already. So thanks to the panelists for their insights. And in a sense, I mean, the journey that you sketched, I mean, from what Janez said at the very beginning about, on the one hand, the supply side of science, getting the foundations right, the importance of knowledge, but then also the exploitation side, building the capability to use it in the policy sphere. I mean, it's really actually the point that we almost just ended on there. And then I heard from the other interventions, quite a lot of really insightful ideas about how we can get the mix right, and sort of try to avoid this cherry picking approach, and try to make the right choices, even if, as Janez said, people are strange, and so they may not necessarily follow what some people might think to be a rational, logical approach. But so I mean, I'll just highlight a few things that I was taking notes on. I mean, one was the importance of this multidisciplinary cooperation. Something that certainly we work very hard on inside the JRC, but it came up very strongly. Another point that Tuula made, which I certainly want to underline, is that policymakers also have relevant strengths. It's not that sort of the scientists are all right and all good, and the policymakers are all bad and sort of somehow corrupted by the world of politics. But the interaction between the two is important, and it's important that the scientists understand the policymakers and the policymakers understand the scientists. And as somebody, as a policymaker running a scientific organization, I can tell you I live that discomfort on a daily basis. So it's it's a genuine tension that we have to try to work from both sides of the spectrum to transcend. We heard from Jim on the one hand about the importance of structural processes. To ensure that we have engagement and that it's clear and transparent, and also the importance of these informal techniques, the webinars, to have more crunchy discussions, perhaps before you get into a more structured or formal end of the process, and also the importance of being very explicit about the differences of points of views. Again, that's something that we work quite hard on. I mean, we talk here about doing evidence-informed policy rather than evidence-based policy, because we need to inform the policymakers about perhaps sometimes the different ways of seeing the evidence, or even the differences of view on the evidence, so that they can ultimately make their political decisions. And then the systematic review process to really help sort things out and differentiate between what do we think is going to be the effect of a decision versus sort of the effect of bias, chance, and other random noise that might be in the system. Again, very important in terms of ensuring a coherent approach. And I thought that Gillian made a very important point right at the end about the cost and the availability of information. If we want to publish what we do in an open way, because we're a publicly funded organization, I think one issue is the availability of scientific work. Another issue that's coming at us is availability of data. And I think we're all becoming there's a vast amount of data out there now, but the openness of data, the transparency of data, and the ability to get access to that data and use it in a multidisciplinary way is, I think, a huge challenge for all scientific organizations going forward. Mm-hmm. And where we see, I'd say as well, a challenge between some of the large data companies who guard their data in quite a proprietary way. So there's some challenges for us as scientists when we're working on misinformation and disinformation, for example, to understand what's going on inside the black boxes of some of the large IT companies, and that's an increasing challenge for us. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, now Jim and then Janez, and then I would like to take some questions from the audience already, because we got very interesting ones, and then we continue. So first Jim and then Janez.
Yeah, I'd quite like to respond just quite directly to Gillian's presentation on systematic review. And just to say, in Working Group 3 of IPCC, there were a small number of us who were very enthusiastic about systematic review and whether we could start to employ some of the techniques for the IPCC assessment. I was one of these people, I should say, because I've applied it in other spheres. But it was very interesting. We had pushback and signs of difficulties. First of all, we asked our authors, had they ever heard of systematic review? And there was a big awareness in Europe and North America, but not in other parts of the world. And some of the pushback that we got came from the idea that if you applied very strict screening criteria to the literature for a specific question, there would be nothing left to review. You'd be reliant on a very small number of papers because the set was less. And we also had pushback from people in developing countries who are already worried about the bias towards English language literature, which they think systematic review favours. So this question of diversity was an important one. We have tried to push it a little bit by getting people in every chapter to think a bit more systematically about the shape of their literature and how it has developed since the previous assessment, so that we can convey a sense of, you know, the dynamics of scientific movement and where things are going. But we really struggled to get, you know, the technique applied in a very hard and specific way. So cherry-picked the techniques, as it were, if I can put it that way.
Thank you, Jim. Can you reply, Gillian, or comment on that before moving to Janez, because it's directly addressing your topic?
Yes, I can, if you don't mind, Janez, me jumping the queue. Jim's points are so interesting to me, because I've given talks about systematic reviews for many years now, and quite often at the end of the talk, a person will come up and say, "I hate everything that you've said about this. It's awful. What about all the stuff that's left on the cutting room floor?" And so Jim's point about some people in his working group saying it's too small a set, and my response usually is, well, why would you want more if what more is worse than less, which is better and more focused? And that's a debate that we have to have about what is included. And perhaps this is why I kind of reject the idea of science as the supply side. It's done, if we do a lot more collaborative participatory science, then we might have a chance of doing science that answers the kinds of questions we want. On the second point of developing countries thinking that they might be disadvantaged, I would say almost the opposite is true, because systematic reviews particularly promote using non-peer-reviewed, non-journal article material, so grey literature in different languages. And in fact, the International Union of Forest Research Organizations, UFRO, runs training courses for developing country scientists in systematic review. It's funded by the USDA Forest Service. That's a fantastic initiative to try and raise awareness amongst this community of scientists who could really make a big impact here, because their costs perhaps of labor, if you like, are less than those of us in Europe. And by working with European or North American or Australian actors, they can be looking at a set of documents which they have no access to normally in their libraries. So I think quite the opposite is true, that you could actually engage a lot more of the world if we use some of these techniques. But I do recognize what Jim says as being it's a problem getting.
Thank you, Gillian.
Really.
I think we should organize, not joking now, Gillian, we should organize a ThinkForest event on systematic review, because I think this is really a tool that we need to learn more how to use it, and I think it will be of high interest. So let's come back. But now, Janez, Tuula, then we move to some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Marc. Very three quick comments. First, on the things which actually Jim said. In science, and you actually ask also that question, in science there will always be different views, but the major advantage which I see from IPCC, from IPBS, from the IRP, which all have different governance structures and advantages and disadvantages, they are all well structured in process and mandate. They are to a certain extent multidisciplinary, and they are creating a kind of critical mass of science through the process, which is based on a kind of internal and external peer review, which is then hardly to be disregarded by the policymakers, which makes them actually strong. I think that's a very important point which we need to understand. Even by saying that, I have to be clear that we are sometimes locked in our own science-based silos. And that's why I have also pushed a few years ago, and this year UNEP actually came with a report of the reports. So trying to look through the reports which were already done. So I think it makes no sense that we try to align the governance processes, because this would be simply too difficult. But when the reports are done, it is really useful if the UNEP, which is basically our driving engine, looks into the essence, compares the notes, and brings something which is common to everything to advise the policymakers, because this is pretty much essential. And the final comment, it's on Gillian, what you said about the NGO. I would just like to share with you my experience. You are absolutely right. There are different, they are not the same. But my experience at average was quite positive. So they were knowledgeable, they were reasonable, they were having majority clear vision, positive agenda, and they were using scientific evidence sometimes better than we did, or at least more honestly. So I have always considered myself as being lucky enough that as a Commissioner for Environment, I have an army of many honest supporters outside the Commission. And I simply use them wisely, but you have to build trust, and you have to be honest with them. That's essential.
Thank you, Janez. Tuula.
Thank you, Gillian. I also like very much this systematic review approach and have to definitely learn more about it. And I'll support Marc's idea to have another seminar or workshop or conference on it. Three things. I think the usability has three important components. It's the relevance, generalizability, and the quality. And I would like to learn more, especially how your method addresses this generalizability, because the sampling and the size of sample and how far the conclusions can be taken from individual studies is very important. And I think that should be somehow addressed in reviews. And this quality issue, I think it is becoming more and more important, because the measures seem to change a lot. Traditionally, we have had these top quality journals with excellent reviewers, which guarantee that the papers that are published are good quality and the conclusions are relevant considering the study setup. But now we have more and more these open access publications, journals, which aim at big numbers of published papers instead of excellent quality review processes. And on the other hand, researchers do not have time to do good reviews because number of manuscripts has increased. So I think that we should also discuss what are the relevant measures for the quality of science and how that can be taken into consideration in the reviews. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuula. And this is probably another topic for another event, because that is really so fundamental and important for the future of science. But let's go now to some questions from the audience. And we have one question coming through a video message. Let's start with that one.
Good morning. My name is Julieta Chieng, and I'm a junior researcher at the European Forest Institute, Bonn office, and I'm also the deputy coordinator of the joint IUFRO-IFSA task force on forest education. My question is, what incentives can we give scientists so that they can put more time and effort into science policy side and not just publications? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliet. Probably Jim, you want to start, or Jim and then Gillian? I am sure you have some good insights.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We tend to find there are some scientists who love getting involved in the science policy interface because they actually do like the sense that their work actually makes a difference. And I'll just take participation in IPCC as a perfect example. It is not rewarded inside the academic systems that I knew, where promotion is based on publication records and top peer-reviewed journals, as has just been mentioned. But people appear to want to do it. I guess my biggest concern is I think there are some scientific communities, probably mainly based around the natural science and climate impacts, where IPCC has become part of the world in which you operate, so people do it. I can tell you with social science, which has been a bit of a mission on my part to get IPCC to pay more attention to a wider range of disciplines. The problem is not so much getting IPCC to take in social scientists. The challenge is to get social scientists to take an interest in IPCC. And I can identify people that I would love to get engaged in IPCC processes, but who do not come in because it's not part of their reward system. And that's not something that can be solved overnight. It's a campaign. Janez said it, repetition, repetition, repetition. That applies to how you're going to try to change some of these social structures and institutional expectations as well, I think.
Thank you, Jim. Gillian, you want to add to this?
Well, no, I mean, I completely agree with Jim. The incentives have to be there for scientists to engage. And as the danger is that you only get people, as Thomas More's Utopia quotes, those men who seek power are least deserving of power. So you have to worry that the people who want to have their voice heard may not be the right people. I'm sure that Jim, that's a bit flippant perhaps, but I think one of the ways of encouraging early engagement before you've built your reputation as a great scientist who can get engaged is the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology in the UK, POST, has these post notes, which are briefs, information briefs on topics, hot topics, and they go to people like first year doctoral students to work with people in the post office to compile these evidence reviews, if you like. They're not systematic reviews, but they are a way of encouraging young PhD scientists to get involved in policy and to stop that kind of arrogance that sometimes we have in science that, oh, don't policymakers know anything? Don't politicians know anything? And it's completely untrue. Some of the meetings I've attended for these post events with parliamentarians, I mean, their thirst for knowledge was great. I mean, one can't judge them all by the people who come on the television and say silly things, but actually the bulk of them are really interested in getting good science. So that might be that sort of thing, maybe internships in the IPCC process. I don't know how it works, or the JRC, getting young scientists really involved in before they worry about, I can't do that review because I need to write a top Nature paper or whatever. So just thoughts from the floor, really.
Yeah, thank you. Tuula, what we can do to encourage scientists to be more engaging with policymakers?
In Finland, we have different funding instruments for attracting people to carry out policy relevant studies. We have big instruments for consortiums for making 5-year studies on policy relevant topics. And then we have this kind of short-term project funding for specific policy questions. And what I would like to encourage researchers to consider is writing papers on those projects and also policy processes. We have excellent policy relevant publications like land use policy and forest policy and economics, where you can write papers on those. And I would like to introduce an idea that even if the publications come later than the processes end, but it might be possible later in the processes refer to those excellent papers and give credits in that way to researchers. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Tuula. Let's get now a question from the audience directly to show you that actually we have an audience. So Professor Gertian Naburs from Wageningen University, are you willing to be that question?
Yeah, thanks, Marc. I am certainly willing to do this, and thanks for the opportunity. Yes. First of all, I also want to state that, well, scientists are, of course, also normal people, and we also bring in
some of them, Gertian, some of them.
Yeah, well, we also bring in our values and background, of course, and we're certainly not impartial. Yeah. That's maybe something to flag as well. And I think as scientists, we also realize how hectic the policy making process is, and that it's influenced by many sides and not just by the rational the rational data and the analysis. But anyway, my question comes to, we saw many structures for linking science to policy, from the Irish, the Forest Policy Group, the knowledge centers at the JRC, the IPCC process, the reviews. It seems we're still struggling even more and more with this relation, and in this hectic world where issues change more and more rapidly. But do you think, some of the people in the panel, a more stable sort of a chief scientific advisor or advisory group, or a more stable structure between the science and ministries, could that work? Could that solve something, some of the issues we heard?
That's a very good question, Gertie, and probably Janez could answer that, because I think the European Commission also tried to develop this figure of the chief scientist. Maybe, yes. Janez, you can reflect on this.
Sure. The first thing which I would like to mention is that when we talk about policymakers, we are sometimes thinking that this is unified group. But it's not. So policymakers are actually the administration on one hand, of course, and policymakers are, of course, those who are elected or selected and are the real politicians. And you have to consider that this relation, so it has to be built on trust, and how you use it needs to go through the whole channel. But on the very good question coming from Gert-Jan, I have quite an interesting experience, because when I was science commissioner, actually I was participating in these G8 meetings of scientists. And from Germany, Italy, France, and the Commission, we were actually represented on the level of ministers for science and research, while US, UK, Canada, and Japan were presented through the chief scientists. Obviously, their role was not exactly the same, but chief scientists were given a quite high level of responsibility and also authority in their countries, based on a very close links normally to the Prime Minister's office. So it's essential to put science about the interest driven by policy debate. So the establishment of the position, it's not guaranteeing real change if not properly integrated in decision making, and if not supported from the top. So European Commission, as you have said, has tried it, then advanced through replacing it through the group of scientists. But I would do the same comment. Again, their strength depends on how they are really integrated, how their voice is heard, how their voice is protected and respected. And that is, in essential, the real position through which then the policymakers can profit from independent advice.
Thank you, Janez. Anyone else want to comment on this question? Tuula.
Thank you. I would like to add to that of course we in policy support need more information on science processes, and that applies for all of us. I like the idea of this chief scientist as well. It may have a role, but in general, I think that this Gillian's systematic review and perhaps EFI conference could also increase this kind of information, how to measure quality of science in the modern world, for example. I think that would be very useful for managers and administrators. Thank you.
Very good idea, Tuula. Jim, you want to add to this?
Yeah. Just it's a question on which I feel extremely agnostic at the moment, because I think it depends a lot on the institutional context. It works in the UK, where I come from, where we've had it instituted for a long time, and the process is well understood, and it is integrated with policy making, as the COVID crisis has absolutely demonstrated. But just to say, the role has changed of a chief scientific advisor since the process was started. And it's important that it's not all going through one person, but that it's a network of advice with a different advisor for every department, where you have policy issues that cut across departments, you can have advice. And each scientific advisor also has an advisory group which provides a wider range of feed-in as well. So I think if you're going to carry that system, you need to think it through carefully, make it structured, and you need to campaign for it and make it work. Otherwise, it won't, would be my view.
Yeah. Very good, Jim. So a really multi-level approach, no? So to insert scientific expertise at different levels. Gillian, very quickly, because I want to get another question.
Yeah, very quickly, nothing to do with systematic reviews, but I think there's a role here, obviously, for these science academies. I mean, in Europe, we're blessed with a lot of groups such as the European Academy Science Advisory Committee, ESAC, and others like them, who can offer this role and do offer this role for policy making in Europe. So the academies have a really huge role, and they are themselves networks of networks.
Yes, thank you. Gillian, you can stay with us. You are part of the family, but I will now read a third question that we got from the audience. It is coming from Luis Guillot from Politico Europe, so a journalist, a question from a journalist. And she's saying, policymakers increasingly speak about taking decisions based on science, especially when it comes to climate change and biodiversity loss. But the example of the EU Green Taxonomy shows us, and especially the criteria for forestry and bioenergy, that politics and national interests can easily downgrade scientific evidence to secondary consideration. So is it utopian to reach for science-based policy making? Who wants to take this? Janez?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, first, as many of us have already said it today, scientists do and will come to different conclusions. So they are human like all of us, but their work is normally peer-reviewed and thus also more trustable. Where there are differences, it's not on policymakers and politicians to judge, but rather on scientists to connect, exchange notes, views, methodological approach, and hopefully close some of the gaps which are existing. That also helps, by the way, the policymakers. So politicizing different conclusions does not help anybody, and science in the first place. Second, I would like to repeat that many times it takes some time that scientific facts prevail. So the recipe, as mentioned before, is repetition, creating trust, ownership, and suddenly this window of opportunity appears. Obviously in forestry, bioenergy, the time was not yet ripe, but we know that the debates inside were long, were quite divisive. So we are coming there, and maybe some time is lost, but there is no reason to give up. So you simply have to continue, because if you lose the hope, it's the worst thing which could be done. Third, the policy making, it's already today, and I would like to be clear about that. It's already today to an important extent science-based. So it would simply not be fair denying that, but it's not ideal indeed, and decisions will at the end be always political, and so it will be the responsibility. So we should just take care that those decisions which we consider that are wrong are publicly exposed by media, critical active citizens, NGOs, and those taking the decisions are actually tested through the democratic process. That's how democracies work. And finally, again, many of you mentioned already that if somebody after experiences the COVID crisis and the lockdown and everything which was connected with that still does not understand the importance of making the policy making even more strictly science-based, then actually nobody can help him or her. Because if after that what we have lived together and we are living still, I think we could limit the damage if we would cooperate better and if we would listen to the science more in advance. Some are saying that the world after the COVID will not be the same again. Unfortunately, it will be very much the same. But hopefully we will understand it better. So the probability of health-related outbreaks, the things which we are constantly hearing from climate scientists, this is real. This is real. If we ignore it, we will simply bear the consequences. That's why I think we simply need to rethink the way we are managing the risks as individuals, collectively, as private companies, public policymakers, locally, globally. So we simply need to collaborate more, build resilient societies, and be better prepared. And the speed And scale for the change needed is actually the one which is the most decisive and worrying in all those processes. So we have no time to lose.
Thank you, Janez. Very inspiring insights. And now we are reaching the end. So any final comments from any of you, but it should be very short, 30 seconds comments. Any of you willing to do that? Fine, then we move to the concluding remarks. And I would like to welcome now our Assistant Director for Policy Support, Lauri Hetemäki. Huomenta, Lauri. And yeah, I am very happy that you are today making these concluding remarks, because you are the person that has positioned the European Forest Institute as an honest science policy broker. So it is really my pleasure.
Okay, thanks, Marc, and good morning, everyone from Helsinki. I hope you can hear me well and see me well. Is that the case?
Very well.
Okay, thank you. Great discussion, very inspiring, and I think the discussion has shown how important this topic is. And I wish to thank all the speakers for sharing their experiences and insights to this topic. And this has been already really successful seminar. I think there's one thing that all speakers agree on. Science-based information is necessary and needed for good policy making. Janez's last point was exactly this. Yet we also know that communicating or using science information for policy making is not always without its hiccups. It has also some inevitable limitation. For example, it can be both produced and used wrongly. Therefore, not all science information is equally good for informing policy making. However, the answer to these challenges is not to do or use less of science, but rather do it better. There are many ways how this can be done, and we have discussed it here today. I will also share my own thoughts on how to do this by pointing out just one approach I find important. I think it also reflects very well the discussion today already. I think the golden approach is to make science policy work holistic and multidisciplinary. The problems we are facing have become ever more complex, such as the nexus of forest, biodiversity, climate change and bioeconomy. Yet science has become ever more specialized and focused on a very specific and detailed questions, since this is how the science advances. It has to set so-called system boundaries and exclude some factors from the analysis to be manageable. Oversimplicity and narrow perspective to science is also enhanced by another phenomenon. The different interest groups and NGOs are fighting for policymakers and media attention. They have the incredible skills to search and select, or as is said, cherry-pick the scientific papers that support their specific agendas and use only those in convincing politicians and media. Scientists may also have their own agendas, which affect the selection of research topics and their scope, as well as fine-tuning the message they deliver. Given these, there seems to be no other escape from this narrow and partial perspective than producing these holistic, multidisciplinary science policy reviews, assessment and synthesis studies, and tailor these in a format that the decision maker can absorb. Therefore, for informing policy making, there is a need for more cooperation amongst the scientists to synthesize cross-disciplinary and multi-perspective science knowledge. I would also add that this should be carried out by scientists with different values, not just among the like-minded ones. This is what, for example, IPCC and the UN International Resource Panel are seeking to do. This is also what we are doing in European Forest Institute science policy work. But this type of work needs to be done also at the national scale. For this to happen, it's also important to provide resources and funding for this type of work. It is not research or science as such, and therefore not funded by the usual research funding sources. Funding must come from the other sources. Dear seminar participants, since 2015, I have been coordinating these ThinkForest events. 19 of these to be exact. ThinkForest was started already 2012 with the pioneering and forward-looking wisdom of Marc Palahí and Ilpo Tikkanen, who was at that time the head of policy program at EFI. Over the years, ThinkForest has grown to be an institution. Maybe one small indication of this is that the name ThinkForest has been copied in its different variation to similar types of science policy forums. I will retire in a couple of months and I'm not anymore coordinating ThinkForest. Therefore, I wish to take this opportunity also to express my warm thanks and gratitude to everyone who have been helping to organize these events, speaking in them and participating in the events. ThinkForest Forum will be needed in future even more than in the past. We are living in a time in which a massive amount of new science information is being published every year. And we need ever more to base decisions on sound evidence in this complex world, as well as seek to increase understanding and reduce the excess polarization of the discussion. ThinkForest is an excellent and necessary forum to respond to these needs. I wish all the best for it, and you who organize, speak and participate in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauri, for your work all this year, for your facts and for your values. And to close the event, I would like to use a quote from Isaac Asimov, who used to say that the saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. And I think this is a good reflection because, to be very honest, science is necessary, but it's not the main thing we need to create a sustainable future. We need, above all, wisdom and rethink our values. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for participating in this ThinkForest event, and I wish you a very nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.